First, let me read this quote from last week, where Dr. Branson writes, he's trying to explain what we called monarchical Trinitarianism, which is a big fancy theological term that most of us are not familiar with. Branson notes, quote, "So what's the logic here?" Speaking about monarchical Trinitarianism, he writes, "Simply put, it's analytic that a father must have a son. This is monarchical Trinitarianism, a kind of a definition of it. God is a necessary being and so exists at all times in all possible worlds. So, if the one God is essentially a father, if fatherhood is what Gregory of Nyssa would call God's idioma, he's speaking of Gregory is one of the three Cappadocian fathers that are recognized in classical Orthodox Christian historical studies, one of those who championed what Dr. Branson recognizes is a Trinitarian perspective of God, but what Dr. Tuggy identifies as a Unitarian perspective of God. So they've got a difference of opinion of what actually Gregory of Nyssa is describing when it comes to the nature of God. So Branson continues, if the one God is essentially a father, and if fatherhood is what Gregory of Nyssa would call God's idioma, roughly what we in analytic philosophy would call God's individual essence, then the Son of God exists and has always existed, right? Contrary to what Dr. Tuggy purports, that Jesus has not always existed, but has in fact been brought into the scene, right onto the scene. He was created by God, perhaps at some time in the past, in eternity past, but not necessarily from all eternity, but farther back than human history records. Jesus was created, the Word of God was brought into creation by God, and then was assigned a human body at his incarnation. This is per Tuggy's Unitarian perspective, but Branson objects. No. If God has always existed as the eternal Father, then this suggests that Jesus has always existed as the eternal Son. Their coexistence is tied together, and their eternal existence is tied together. That's the point that Branson's trying to make. Indeed, Branson concludes, Jesus' eternality necessarily exists as the eternal Son. But if the Son of God is himself a necessary being, just like the Father is a necessary being, then he, the Son, is not a creature. And if the Son of God is not a creature, then he is divine, with all of the attributes that God expresses as divinity. I might fill in what Branson's trying to assert here. So it's with that I jump now down into Branson's clarification of the importance of his view known as monarchical Trinitarianism, or MT. And he's going to contrast that with two other views of Trinitarianism known as social Trinitarianism, which he labels ST, and relative identity Trinitarianism, which Branson labels RI. These are also labels that Tuggy himself uses in his definitions of Trinitarian theology. And I'm trying not to make your head spin with these definitions, but it's important for us let me try to see if I can distill what Branson's about to say for us, and then I'll close tonight's study. What Branson's trying to get us as modern Trinitarian adherents to appreciate is that when we Trinitarians encounter the objections from modern-day Unitarians, such as Dr. Dale Tuggy, or your modern critics who object to the idea that Jesus can't be God for various X amount of reasons, and it's not unusual to hear modern-day skeptics of the Trinitarian position object to the Trinitarian position based on their assumption that the Bible is a Unitarian book, and that the New Testament writers were writing from the Unitarian position, which then led into the early first century debates about Unitarian versus Trinitarian, in which the early early church fathers also adopted a Unitarian position. In other words, the common argument from Unitarians today is that Trinitarian theology is a modern invention of the Catholic Church that was fabricated by the Catholic Church later on, 5th, 6th centuries later on down the road, in order to help these Catholics try to figure out the inner nature of God and Jesus and hypostatic union and all that other stuff. But these Unitarians of today would have us Trinitarians believe that the original position of the early first Christians, which was based on the early on the apostolic scriptures itself, is actually Unitarian. That's the argument. That's what's at stake here. And Dr. Branson is going to say, go back and do your history. Go back and research very carefully. Not only are the early first church fathers not Unitarian primarily, right? Speaking of for instance, the Cappadocians, right? The two Gregorys and those people. But the Bible itself, the Apostolic Scriptures, is also a Trinitarian book. It's not a Unitarian book. All right, but he's going to use this. He's going to articulate this using his view known as monarchical Trinitarianism. So let me just read this passage here, and then I'll shut down tonight's study. All right.